Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of our comparison of one-page rules and Games Workshop. As we continue our exploration of each company and gaming system, please remember that despite what the title of the video implies, the goal of this comparison is to look at the strengths and weaknesses rather than to simply declare that one game is superior to the other. In the end, it's up to every player to decide what games they play and what system they think is the best. Okay, with that out of the way, let's move on. So far, in our comparison, we've looked at the cost, lore and world building, and community. In this video, we're going to tackle, I think, one of the most important elements of any tabletop war game, and that's the models. This is going to be a little tricky because we have a lot of things we want to look at. For example, the range of available models, the quality of the sculpts, the difficulty in building, and the materials that these models are made out of. So as we've done in the previous three videos, let's start with Games Workshop. So Games Workshop, I think, makes some absolutely gorgeous models. In the 40 years that they've been making models, they have made huge leaps and bounds in model production, quality, and detail. I mean, just look at the models for Nagash and Archaon for some great examples. These new models clearly deserve the title of centerpiece. And it's not just the big characters. The basic models that they produce have improved as well. When I started out with my high elf models when I was a kid, they were one-piece pewter models that you just took out of the blister pack, glued to the base, attached the shield, and that was it.
It only took me 10 seconds, 11 taps.
A year after I started playing, GW started releasing those new plastic high elf kits that were modular and more complex. Now, I already had my full army, so I didn't buy any of those. But those new models had more detail, the details were sharper, and they could be built and posed individually to give the finished regiment a much more organic kind of look. Carry that into the present when you get the Lumineth Realm Lords, and those models I think are absolutely fantastic. Now, GW has had a few misfires, like Mephiston sniffing his finger here. Yeah, that's a super intimidating pose. Okay, so we've got this dramatic increase in quality, but that does have a downside, and I mean a downside other than just cost. As the models get more complex, they become more difficult to build and require a lot more effort to paint. There's also the question of kit bashing, but I'll talk about that a bit later. So when it comes to the models arriving in lots of pieces so that you can build everything from the ground up, that's actually really cool because then the building is a creative process. You're creating every individual soldier, infantry, vehicle, whatever, as you build it. But the new models are not only more pieces, but they're monopose. So the kits take longer to build than they did before, and at the end, your unit of whatevers looks exactly like everyone else's unit of whatevers. It almost turns building models into a labor tax or a chore. At least it has the possibility of doing that. Personally, I don't mind the building that much as long as I have a good movie to watch, a good book to listen to, or something else so that the focus is the book or the movie and not this tedious process of building the same models over and over and over with 6-piece kits just to build the torso. Now, I fully understand why GW is doing this, at least I understand it from a business perspective. They're fighting recasters. Small pieces are hard to recast properly. And so the more pieces that you put in a single unit or a single model, especially pieces that are very spindly or require a lot of precision, are more difficult to recast. And that's why GW now has models where one piece of the model has the right foot, part of the back, and half of the left arm. And the other piece crosses over as an X, whereas before, legs were a piece, torso was a piece, each arm was a piece. So by doing these new kits, GW is better able to protect its products and its IP, but for us players, it's just coming across as more work. The old pewter middies were uniform, but very easy to build. The previous plastic kits were challenging but modular. The new kits are challenging and uniform. We're getting the worst of both worlds here. And this increasing complexity and time could present a bit of a barrier to new players. If you've never built or painted models like this before, it's a lot more daunting to start with current GW kits than those old pewter ones. Now, For us seasoned players, it's not that big of a deal because we have other armies built and painted, and we can use them in the meantime and still get to play games while we're now building our newest project. But for players new to the game, entirely new, they can't enjoy a game until they've gone through the work to build the models, and that increasingly can take more and more time. Now, GW has attempted to address this problem with the push-fit models, and it's a reasonable solution. It allows you to build an army without any glue, with only having maybe 2 or 3 pieces per model. It's a great way to introduce that side of the hobby. The downside, of course, is that most of the units for most of the armies aren't available in push-fit kits. So then, new players are limited to just the specific armies and units that are being pushed in that edition's starter box. And they can only play those until they get the tools, the time, and the confidence to start to tackle the kits that you actually have to build with glue. And gluing models, that's a rite of passage in this hobby. If you've never glued your fingers together or to your models, if you've never had a chemical burn on your skin, or my favorite, your glue bottle, it feels like it might be a little bit plugged, so you squeeze it just a bit and end up baptizing your model into the Church of Loctite. Until you have that happen to you, you have not truly built models. Okay, let's talk a bit about kit bashing here. Now, I've never been that good at it myself, but I can definitely appreciate the appeal of doing it, and I can certainly applaud those who do it right. With the old pewter minis, kit bashing was pretty much impossible. The newer plastic kits made all the shoulder and arm joints interchangeable, so it was relatively easy to switch out arms and legs or torsos, and it was also easy to maybe snip off one model's hand and to glue on a different hand. But with the new kits, they have such elaborate poses that it's very difficult to kit bash unless you have the time, the skill, and the money to buy 3 different GW kits and a half ton of green stuff to kit bash what you want to make a single model. Now, those who can do it right are absolutely amazing, and GW is right to show them off on the Warhammer community page. But it seems to me that kit bashing is starting to polarize as model quality increases. You either have to go to a professional who can do it right, or you really don't do it at all because the time, effort involved, it's more than most players want to do. The middle of the road, the good enough standard, I think it's vanishing. Okay, so let's move on a bit and talk about terrain, because those are models. This is another area where quality has made massive leaps, but not without some significant costs. So if we travel back in time to the 1980s and 90s, Games Workshop didn't make much terrain at all. They had a few massive pieces like the Fantasy Castle, but instead they sold a book on how to take ordinary household stuff and make wargame terrain out of it. So folks had to learn how to use foam board, sheets of insulation, old toys, stuff from train sets, whatever they could find to make their terrain. As the ability to make bigger and bigger models in plastic improved, GW started creating their terrain line, and I think a lot of the terrain they make is just as impressive as the actual models they make. From massive fortification pieces to tiny scatter terrain, GW pumps out an impressive array of terrain that covers a wide variety of themes, genres, settings, all that stuff. Now, the downside, of course, is that their terrain isn't cheap, just like their models. And the terrain is getting more detailed, which makes it more time-consuming to build and to paint. Now, if you're a hardcore hobbyist who really likes spending weeks and weeks painting a giant set of fortress walls, that's fantastic. Go for it. But for players who don't, it means that they either have to play at their friendly local gaming store, or they have to use scratch-built and makeshift terrain at home, which I think it adds effect. When you have good-looking terrain and good-looking models, it makes the game that much more enjoyable. But if the cost of terrain is really steep, players could either spend hundreds of dollars for one set of table terrain, or they could spend that same amount and buy an entirely new army. And my guess is they're probably going to go for the army. You may notice in the bat reps that I've posted, I've got a pretty good collection of terrain, but that's because I bought it all when I worked at GW and got it for half price. I don't know if I would have spent that much on terrain if I didn't. Now, the good news is that there are alternatives. Companies like Gale Force 9 sell some really great terrain pieces that are solid, pre-printed, and they look great. MDF terrain is also becoming a really viable alternative. And now that more MDF terrain is coming pre-printed, it's a really viable alternative. Take a look at the kits sold by Monster Fight Club for the Cyberpunk Combat Zone. Those are really good-looking terrain pieces. They build pretty fast, they're really sturdy, they might not have quite the right aesthetic for 40K and Sigmar, but they show the potential of what pre-printed terrain can actually do. There's also those terrain, the fold-out stuff. Now, I haven't seen much of that, so I'd be curious to explore that a little bit. That seems to me the easiest way to do it, although, again, having not seen it, I don't know how well the quality is of those kinds of pieces of terrain. All right, so a few quick comments about model materials before we move on. Now, I know many players who like it. I hate pewter models. I just don't like it. It's heavy, it's not as detailed. Even if you spray your pieces with a protective coating or a sealant or something like that, they still chip if they bump into each other. If you drop them, they're going to break or bend. I just don't like them. Then you got resin, and that's a bit of a spectrum. Fine cast was a total disaster that required lots of cleaning. They were really fragile, and frequently they were miscast. So for me, hard plastic is where it's at least in my opinion. And particularly, I like the hard plastic that companies like Games Workshop and Warlord Games uses. I've built plastic kits from other companies like Mantic or Parabellum Games, but those kits use a different kind of plastic that just isn't as good. The stuff from Mantic, it was a hard plastic, but it seemed like it actively resisted gluing, plus the model pieces didn't always fit nice and flush. And the Parabellum sprues, they're built really well, except they have these really large contact points where the sprue connects with the model, and each piece you have to clean with a hobby knife after cutting it. Now you have to do that with GW, but it was a much easier task. The little bits came off quickly, unless they were in a hard-to-reach place. It only took a second or two and was very easy, but with the Conquest kits, it took long enough that I actually started to notice how much I was having to do. The new Cyberpunk Combat Zone also uses a plastic, but it's a soft plastic. It's the same stuff that Noble Knight Games uses for example, their Batman miniatures game. It's very soft, and so when you try and clean off the flash, the model actually kind of just gives rather than letting you shave off that excess that excess plastic. So you have to push a little bit harder to actually get it, and then you run the risk of snapping the piece. Plus, I found that it doesn't glue as well as I'd like either. So for me, it's plastic kits for the win all day. And Games Workshop moving everything from metal and resin over to plastic, I think, is a big, big win. Okay, so what about one-page rules? Well, rather than sell models, One-Page Rules sells STL files. And they contract with a third party to print those models if you don't have a 3D printer and you want to buy them pre-made. Now, like Games Workshop, One-Page Rules has been steadily improving the quality and detail of their models and miniatures, or at least of the files. They've also begun producing massive centerpieces, as well as both large and small terrain. I've printed a fair number of their models, and yes, there's a slight decrease in quality and detail from what you'd get with a GW kit. And plus, with a GW kit, you don't have to worry about handling uncured resin. But as I said before, I don't mind my centerpiece models having lots of details, but I don't want to paint a half a dozen trinkets and bits and bobs on every single troop model that I have. The simplicity of One-Page Rules models isn't always a bad thing. And given how young One-Page Rules is and how recently they've started designing and selling their own model line, I'm impressed with what they can produce. Right now, Games Workshop has the advantage of better quality and ease of acquisition, but at a very steep price. And I think that as 3D printers get better, faster, cheaper, and easier to use, I think Games Workshop is going to start to struggle to justify their prices for these complex multi-part kits that you can't customize. Whereas with an STL file, you can do all the customizing, mixing, and matching on a computer and then just print the entire model out as a single whole. It's offering the simpleness of the old pewter models, but the customization of the plastic kits. One-Page Rules STL files in their model-agnostic game also allows you to avoid gatekeeping. For example, Space Marine Devastators. The kit only has 2 of each weapon. So you get to build 5 Marines, but if you want all of them to have las cannons, you have to buy another box. You just wanted 5 Marines and 5 las cannons, but even after buying 2 boxes, you have 10 Marines and 4 las cannons for double the price, and you still don't have what you wanted in the first place. Now, in terms of materials for 3D printing, the resin, there is quite a spectrum. You can go on Amazon and buy just a standard bottle of resin that sells for about 40 bucks. But there's also resin that markets itself as super high quality, specially built for tabletop minis, which can cost up to double the price of the regular stuff. Some resins are very flexible, some are very brittle. One of the down parts about resin is if you drop it on a hard surface, it's going to shatter way more than a plastic model will. I've dropped some GW plastic models, watched them bounce across a concrete floor, and then pick them up to find no damage whatsoever. Whereas you drop a resin model on concrete, it's going to break. And I found that 3D printing resin doesn't always work well with glue. So if you drop a model and it breaks, you can glue it together, but it's not as easy. Plus, some of these 3D printed models, because resin doesn't take glue very well, it's very hard when the contact points are small. If you're gluing, for example, a hand on a model's wrist, it doesn't always attach very well. You have to sit there and hold it for a long time until the glue fully dries. It's not quite as nice as working with a plastic where as soon as they make contact, they're going to start sticking. Another thing to consider is the startup cost to 3D print, which can be very steep. On top of that, 3D printing is messy. It handles potentially dangerous chemicals, and there's a bit of a steep learning curve as you figure out how to set up the printer, how to work the software, how to print it, how to clean it, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas with Games Workshop, you go to the store, you buy a box, you open the box, you got the pieces. So there's all that stuff to keep in mind. However, even with all of that, One-Page Rules has an advantage with models that I think tips the video in their favor. If you don't like OPR's models, if you don't want to mess with 3D printing, if you really like the models that Games Workshop puts out, then use them. One-Page Rules doesn't care. In fact, here's a simple Venn diagram to illustrate the point. The game's model agnostic. You can continue to buy and paint Games Workshop models exclusively, and you can still play One-Page Rules, whereas the inverse isn't true of Games Workshop. If you plan on playing at an official Warhammer store, playing in any major Warhammer tournaments, you must use Games Workshop products. Games Workshop has even started to put restrictions on 3D printing in terms of printing extra pieces, different heads, stuff like that on their miniatures, to make sure that people aren't using other models or products more than they're using Games Workshop's products. Now, you can probably proxy stuff at your friendly local gaming store, but depending on the gaming scene, on the owners of the store, on the gaming community, some proxying might still get you into a bit of trouble with other players, depending on what you're trying to get away with. For example, I once had to put my foot down when I was going to play against someone who wanted to use a tank from Bolt Action as a proxy for a Lehman Russ. The models were less than half the size of what it was supposed to be, and this player wanted me to accept that. He was able to hide the tank behind a bush, whereas normally a Lehman Russ has trouble taking cover behind a building. So in that case, I had to just be like, no, I'm a pretty casual gamer, I allow a lot of leeway, but when your proxy gives you a very distinct advantage like that, that doesn't work. I also saw a game where a guy played Lizardman in the old fantasy game, and he wanted to bring a Lord Croak, but he didn't have one, so he actually brought a Beanie Baby. Everyone in the store just kind of looked at him and said nothing until he took it off the table and said, I guess not, and then they went on playing. So there are limits to proxying. I totally get that. Alright, so when we can come to the end here, Games Workshop has better models, better quality, and better material. But OPR is catching up. And even if you don't like One-Page Rules stuff, there's amazing STL files out there from dozens of other creators. There's one company that makes STL files called Arch Villain. You can find them on My Mini Factory. And they make models, or files I should say, that easily could challenge stuff like the Nagash model for awesome centerpiece. And even if you don't want to fiddle with any kind of 3D printing at all, then just buy models from whatever company you want on the entire planet. I can play one-page rules using an entire army of Games Workshop models, but I can't play Warhammer using anything but Games Workshop models. So when it comes to which models you can put on the table, the game system that says all of them has all of the advantages over the game system that says just ours. So for this one, I've got to say one-page rules, and they're allowing the game to be model agnostic is what gives them the advantage here. So thanks for watching. Leave your comments down below. Let me know if there's a particular game company that you like that makes really good models, or a particular company that makes really good STLs, because I guarantee you there's a lot of people out there who are looking for other places to buy models. So thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.